So I'm joined now by Johnny O'Reilly. We're very grateful to have him. Johnny, just tell us where you are this morning.
Well, right now I am in Lviv, the capital of the west of Ukraine. I have been based in Kiev for most of the war and just arrived here yesterday. I'm on a little break from my usual journalism here. David McSavage, the Irish comedian, has come out to join me, and I'm helping him do a comedy tour of the country.
Okay, so I'm just going to start you, maybe if we just go into issues of background, just tell us where you're from in Ireland and how you got to Ukraine. I think it involved a detour via Russia as well. So just a little bit about your background, Johnny. I know you're a writer and a filmmaker.
Yeah, well, I'm from Dublin. I grew up in Dublin, went to college there, studied Russian in university. And as a student, I traveled to Russia in 1993, lived there for 8 months and fell in love with the place, with the language. And thereafter, always looked for reasons to go back there, especially after I finished college. I started working as a filmmaker. So I was constantly looking for projects that I could make there. I was always inspired by the stories and the history of the place. Throughout the 90s, I visited a few times. And then in 2006, I went there and stayed for a block of 10 years. So I put in about 12 years altogether in Moscow. And then went back to Ireland for a bit, lived in the States, and then wanted to return to Moscow in 2019. But Zelensky had just come to power in Ukraine. And with it, the promise of reform. There was a new young government in charge, and they were filmmakers. So I just thought I would like to check out Kiev as a place to stay. And I just visited here in August of 2019, really liked it, and started working here in the film industry.
Just tell us,
the pandemic started. So.
Just focusing on the film part of it, just for the moment there. So you're trying to make movies in Ukraine, or you have been. Is that easy?
I've lived in Ukraine for 3 years, pretty much through the whole pandemic and the war. So in that environment, it wasn't easy to make movies here, but I've spent most of the time writing and developing new projects. I have made 2 Russian language feature films in this region, one in Russia and one in Ukraine, both Russian language movies. The first one was a psychological thriller. It was kind of pitched as Coen Brothers meets Hitchcock in a very remote weather station. It was a contained thriller that did some, good business, if you like, in the International Film Festival circuit and in Russia. And then my next movie was Moscow Never Sleeps, which was billed as Magnolia set in Moscow. It was a multi-narrative social drama. And that was a movie which got quite a good release in Russia and in the US and a few other countries.
And that was a celebration of Moscow, really. So at one time you were an enthusiast for the experience of Russia, both as a place to live and what did you think about the politics at the time?
Well, I still am an enthusiast for Russia, for all things Russian, well, except for the government and the politics. And it's something that is quite difficult here in Ukraine, because many Ukrainians kind of lump everything in together in terms of Russian culture and Russian political culture. But for me, I certainly see them very differently. I had a wonderful time in Russia. I have some great friends there, a lot of people I really admire. But of course, the political culture is completely different, and to me, in my mind, very separate from the experiences that I had, the personal ones at least.
And did the politics, was there a sense of a dramatic evolution of the politics over the time you were there and since?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't even say it's a dramatic, it's a dramatic evolution, but it's always been heading in the one direction. For 20 years since Putin took power, Unfortunately, the pessimists have always been right in their predictions of how repressive Putin would become. Of course, overnight on February the 24th, that was a very dramatic evolution of Putin's policies, but he has been heading in this direction for 20 years.
And you had an interesting experience on Russian TV, which figured in global news a few years ago, just before you left. Can you just describe that a little bit?
Yeah, I was invited to appear on a live chat show on a network called Life News, which is one of the most egregious propaganda TV channels in Russia. Normally, I wouldn't accept, but this day happened to be National Filmmakers Day. They have all these days. They have Teachers Day, Soldiers Day. This was National Filmmakers Day. And at the time, Oleg Sentsov, a Ukrainian filmmaker, was in prison in Russia under political reasons. And I just thought, well, I'll appear on the show, given that it's live, and I'll say something about it. So I, from the start, just basically said that, we should remember today that, Oleg Sentsov is in prison for political reasons. And fairly quickly, the producer of the show, or the channel, I don't know, sent a message to the interviewer, and they shut the interview down live on TV. So it was just a little moment that went viral, but there was no repercussions or anything like that for me in it.
So you left Russia with no particular ill feelings, and that certainly hadn't expedited your departure.
No, but I think what had expedited my departure was the fact that I probably could not make the type of movies that I wanted to make. Like my film Oscar Never Sleeps was financed just before the war in Donbass. And since the war in Donbass, there's been increased scrutiny of all culture in Russia, increased censorship. And there's no way I would have gotten that movie financed after the Donbass. But, by the time the movie had been out and I was considering other projects in 2018, 2019, the kind of movies that I wanted to make could not have been made in Russia. So that creeping censorship was one of the reasons that I left. But it wasn't like any threat to me personally or politically.
Okay, so you left and you moved to Kiev. Just describe to us a little bit what Kiev is like as a place to live.
Well, Kiev's really lovely. I sometimes describe it as a bohemian paradise, because a lot of the lovely cities that we all know well around France, Spain, and Italy, there's a feeling, especially at the height of the summer, that they're a bit commercially exploited because they're so popular. There's just so many tourists go there. So I often feel that the more east you go, even Croatia nowadays is just jam-packed during the peak season. But Ukraine has wonderful places to visit, including Kiev, where you still have this kind of pop-up culture. Some young people just find a shed and turn it into a really cool little hipster cafe, and there's no rules about what they can buy or sell or when they can close or open, and they have their friends come in and play live music. So it's just full of really charming little corners like that. It's a cheap country, so you can live in there. You can afford to have a nice apartment in the center, and the weather's really nice. You have al fresco dining from usually from March, April until October, and there's a lot of interesting events and cultural ongoings, and also if you like to keep healthy, there's a lot of beaches and cycling routes. So it's a really nice place to be during the summer. The winter's a different story, as it is in many places, but that coupled with the feeling that it's a country on the cusp. Now I'm talking about pre-war. This was a country that is young, 20, 30 years old, and many people are engaged in entrepreneurial activities. They're starting things that are new to the country. It's the first ever this or that in the country. And a lot of them are very young, and you kind of get swept up in this feeling of not only are you developing a career or an entrepreneurial idea for yourself, but you're also building the future of the country. So that's
so. Is it true to say that I visited you, Johnny, in Kiev just in August of last year. I found it utterly charming and in many ways very sophisticated. But there was a certain innocence, and more particularly, I thought, a dramatic optimism to the place, which is what makes this war all the more tragic. Would you agree with that?
I mean, on the surface, yeah. Like, the places that I brought you to are all the nicest places in the city centre. Obviously, you go further afield, you go out to the small villages, you go out to the small towns, and that's where you see the poverty. It is still the poorest country in Europe by GDP. So
it's even a third. Like, it's significantly poorer even than Russia. I think the national income is only a third as much per head as in Russia. So people forget that. So it's a country of contrasts.
Yeah, that's true. It's still significantly poorer than Russia. It has, obviously focused in the city center of the capital city, you get a skewed view of the whole country. So, my experience is very much on a daily basis that, city center, capital. But, you live in some of the small towns or villages, there's very little economic activity. Any young people with ambition, they leave those places, they come to the big cities. But, it was a country that was on the march very much before the war. And that's part of the reason for the war, that, Putin could see the military and the economic development taking place here. So, it's a country that has been on the march, and I suspect will continue to be after the war.
So describe a little bit about what the atmosphere is like in Kiev or Lviv now.
Well, two cities very, very different. I mean, yes. Kiev was practically surrounded by the Russians. The curfew is very severe there. Most shops are not open. In Lviv, you wouldn't know the war is on. Actually, there's just all the shops are open. People are walking around. So the atmosphere in Kiev is a bit more interesting because they have had the near-death experience of. Almost being surrounded by Russian troops, and the atmosphere there is, it's quiet. Like, there's not much going on. There's no events on. Very few bars and restaurants are open, and those that are closed around 7:00. But people are trying their best to be normal and to go back and do what they always did. The weather's changing now. It's getting warmer, so you do see more kind of young people around the place. But I wouldn't say there's tension. There's less tension now than there was. Actually, the tension is dissipating.
What's day-to-day life like? Are most people going to work? People sleep at night? Are food supplies getting through? How normal is it in Kiev in particular?
The shops seem to be full. They're okay. Right now, there's a problem with petrol. So I drove here from, it was like a 7-hour journey from Kiev to Lviv. And the big issue I had was finding petrol. I'd say only about 5 or 10% of the petrol stations are actually selling petrol. And when you go there, you have to queue up for perhaps even 45 minutes to get petrol. And they only give you like 10 euros of petrol, and you need at least 30 euros of petrol for the journey that I took. So petrol is an issue at the moment, but food is not in Kiev.
And the mood, like, are people scared minute by minute, or are people,
No. No, not in Kiev. I mean, they're scared in other cities, obviously, where there's still a lot of bombardment going on. But in Kiev, they're not.
So you've been out and seen some of the worst depredations. You were in Bucha. Can you just describe briefly what you found there?
So yeah, there's about 3 or 4 towns that are little satellite towns just northwest of Kiev that have now become household names around the world. Bucha, Kostomel, Irpin, Makarev. Bucha is kind of an upmarket satellite town, something akin to Malahide in Ireland, in Dublin. And there were about 1,000 or 1,200 people there during the occupation. So there's been a huge massacre in Bucha itself. Many of the people who were there were elderly. Many of them died in the final days of Russian occupation, when the Russian forces realized that they were losing, and they were, they feared, or they suspected, a lot of the local population of sharing information about their positions, and that and many other elements led to the massacre. So when you go there, what you see now, it's been cleaned up a bit, but when I went there, the first thing you see are smashed up, burnt out, shot up civilian vehicles. And these are the cars that families would have tried to flee the area in as it was being surrounded, or as it was being attacked. And anything that moved was a target for, tanks, for machine gun fire. And then the second thing you see are Russian armored vehicles, including tanks, that are just burnt out. These are vehicles that would have been targeted by the British supplied NLAWs or American supplied Javelins, which have proved to be so successful, particularly in the taking on the Russians who came from Belarus in the north and offensive. So you see all these vehicles smashed up, and then you see the buildings that are just crumbled completely to the ground, and huge amounts of them. This was obviously a policy by the Russians to lay waste to these towns, and it's straight from the playbook that they used in Aleppo and in Grozny. So it's quite stunning visually when you see all this destruction. The place where I saw the biggest amount of destruction was the airport at Hostomel.
Yeah,
and this is a very important strategic place. Like one of the main targets for the Russians in the early days of the northern offensive around Kiev were the multiple airfields that were around the capital city. The biggest one is at Hostomel. That is run by the company Antonov, which famously make the biggest airplanes in the world. So their runway is really long, and with that runway, the Russians could have landed multiple hundreds and thousands of troops on an hourly basis. And that if they had securely taken that airport, they could very quickly take Kiev, was the calculation. But the US intelligence services had information about all of this in advance, shared that information with the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians secretly placed a lot of their anti-aircraft, a lot of their resources, their human resources, soldiers, in and around the Hostomel airport. So that was fought over, won and lost by both sides over a 10 or 12 day period. And it, when you go there, it's unbelievable the amount, like hundreds and hundreds of crumpled, mangled Russian armored vehicles and tanks. So that visually is really stunning.
And is there a sense of in the likes of Bucha and Hostomel, of people trying to get back to normal life now?
I didn't hear the beginning of that, but I think So Bucha and Hostomel, people are trying to get back to normal life there, but not many people are returning, because a lot of their properties have been destroyed. So there would be, of course, an effort to try and get back to normality, but people who their homes have been destroyed need to wait a long time before they can afford to build something back. A lot of people don't have any jobs, so I think of course there would be an effort to get back to normal, but the war is still ongoing. One of the problems and the issues in the whole of the country, and that would include myself, is it's very hard to make long-term plans when you don't know the outcome of the war. So people are doing their best to get back to normality, to create normality, but when you can't make long-term plans, that's hard.
And do you think, has the war shown anything in particular about Ukrainian character?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, look, the Ukrainians have shown great bravery and courage and sacrifice, and great morale. Throughout history, Ukraine has always been at the crossroads of these great big empires. So they've always been fighting for their independence, for their sovereignty. It's something that's seared into the country's history, and feels like it's seared into the soul of every individual Ukrainian. As soon as this started to happen, they all kind of reverted to that historical cause. Like, we will fight to the death for our country's freedom and sacrifice. And you have so many young people, hipsters, young women, everyone repeating the same mantra. People are obviously scared. People tell you that it's stupid not to be scared, but I've witnessed such bravery and courage in the face of this onslaught. But I think there are also other reasons why they can be confident about their chances, given the fulsome support by Biden's administration and the international community, and Zelensky's excellent performance in rallying the international community around the Ukrainian cause. So people are very upbeat, confident, and willing to sacrifice a lot to achieve victory.
So obviously there's a lot of goodwill in Ireland. I don't know if you did, is it your sense that Ireland's doing enough for Ukraine?
Yeah, there's a lot of goodwill across Europe for Ukraine, and I would imagine even more so, of course, in Ireland. And partly that's due to obviously the reality of what's happened, but also through the excellent performance by Zelensky and how he has led the country and shaped the image of the country to the international community. So yeah, you do have that feeling, but it's funny. I just speaking to a friend today who is she is living in Riga and has been in Berlin, and she's received a lot of help and support from wherever she's gone. But she's kind of happy to be in Lviv for a short trip, because she said there's too much pity. Everywhere she goes, people are like, pitying her so much. Oh, you must be, So anyway, that was just a funny little observation that she made to me. But yeah, look, people are really supportive of Ukrainians, and certainly that it feels that way. And not only is it important to show and express that support, but also it's interesting that before the war, one of the observations I would have made about Ukraine and Ukrainian culture is that they suffered from negative stereotypes always. They're always just the stereotypes that are kind of exemplified by that character in the story or in the Netflix show Emily in Paris. This young kind of rather uneducated Ukrainian character in the film or in the series. It caused a lot of furore here because yet again another negative stereotype in the international press about Ukrainians. But certainly this war has done away with that.
But just on that, the naysayers note that Ukraine has long been a very corrupt country, but in particular, there's just an undercurrent in a certain sector of the Irish commentariat that there's a significant element of Nazism in Ukraine, and the Azov regiment, I suppose, is pointed to in that respect. Just tell us a little bit and put in perspective how Ukraine has dealt with its minority of.
Yeah, there has been a lot of corruption. And, look, the Ukrainians will claim that one of the reasons there's been a lot of corruption, the malign influence of Russia, which is true to a certain extent, but there's no doubt that this has been an extremely corrupt country. One gets the feeling that there's going to be zero tolerance towards corruption in after the war, but of course it's going to be an even longer battle dealing with that. But with regards to the existence and the influence of neo-Nazism in the country, that's nothing more than a Russian propaganda trope based on a few facts regarding the Azov Battalion, which is quite an important trope in the Russian propaganda battle. It's part of the reason why the conquest of Mariupol is so important to Putin. So the Azov Battalion, named after the Azov Sea, where Mariupol is, was formed in 2014. And the first few dozen of members of that, some of them were far right, paramilitaries, and some of them were neo-Nazis. And of course, those guys had swastika tattoos on them. But they proved to be a very effective fighting force in the Donbass war in the 2014-15, and they grew and became bigger, and eventually were subsumed into the National Army. So that kind of neo-Nazi influence was totally diluted within the regiment and, of course, within the armies. There's nothing neo-Nazi about the army. It's a very professionally run army that conforms to all NATO standards and obviously has very good relations with other NATO commanders, given the support that they've received from them. But Russia has been looking for propaganda narratives that can sell the war in their own country. So they put up this idea that the Azov Battalion have infected the country, and basically, that neo-Nazi political trend has taken over, and therefore the country is neo-Nazi. But it couldn't be further from the truth. The far-right political parties in this country, unlike those in France, in Poland, and in Russia, in Ukraine, have never received more than 4% of the vote. Now, that's not to say that there is not a kind of a certain xenophobia against Russia, which there is for historical reasons, in the same way
and some current reasons, of course.
And current, yeah, but no, that's nothing more than just a propaganda narrative on behalf of the Russians.
So I suppose the biggest question then, it must be enormously on your mind in particular, is how do you see this war finishing? What can happen? Are you optimistic for Ukraine?
Well, yeah, optimistic isn't such a word that you can use given such a terrible event, but it seems, I mean, look, yeah, if I was to make a prediction, my prediction would be this, but I can't say with certainty that obviously it's going to come about. But I think that Biden, I mean, it comes down to, the whole thing comes down to a war of wills, or battle of wills between Putin and Biden. And I think Biden has decided that he's willing to put considerable political capital into this fight, and has convinced other world leaders to do the same. And they have decided that Putin must lose, not that he must be, fought to a standstill, but that he must lose. He must be pushed back to pre-Feb 24th borders. And they are providing the heavy armaments in order to achieve that result. So, what happened 2 weeks ago in Munich was pretty unprecedented. You had 40 countries, and not just NATO countries. You had countries like Japan, New Zealand, Tunisia, for God's sake, coming together to commit heavy armory to the Ukrainians. So that's has started to flow. I don't believe it has reached the peak levels in terms of arriving at the Ukrainian front lines. But I think over the next few weeks you will see that to happen. Now, of course, the Russians can continue to make their own armaments probably at a faster rate than which the Western powers can deliver armaments to the Ukrainians. But I think the technological advance or superiority of the NATO armaments will tip the balance in Ukraine's favor, as well as obviously the strong morale of the Russians on the Ukrainian side. So I predict that the Ukrainians will push them back, but I don't know for sure. I could be wrong, of course. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And just then on a different level, the David McSavage tour, which you're effectively producing, is there anything that people in Ireland can do to support that, or anything else that people in Ireland can do to support people in Ukraine that you could recommend?
Well, actually, we have set up a FundMe page, so I'd love if you could link that to your listeners. It's basically it's a series of free concerts. Obviously countries have been delivering medicine, food, and heavy armaments, and we're just adding comedy to that list. So we want to entertain people for free and provide some kind of a bit of light entertainment in the darkness of war, if you like. But we're also raising finance in Ireland to distribute amongst worthy causes as we drive around the country. So there is a GoFunded page, so I'd be very grateful for any funds that your listeners can contribute.
Okay, we'd be pleased to link to that. So Johnny O'Reilly, thank you very much for giving us so much of your time, and you're uniquely informed. I believe when you were in Kiev, you were the only Irishman left in the city. So we're grateful for your taking time out to talk to us, and take care of yourself.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael.